Good afternoon, everyone. All right, now. Today, I wanted to discuss how we view Christ's actions in the Bible. Many of Christ's actions, when we look at them, were deliberate, with intention. Many of the things he said, there was deliberancy and intention behind what he said, when he said it, where he said it, and why he said it. And a lot of times, as you read the narrative, it may elude you of those qualities, of that aspect, connected to what he was saying, why he was saying, when he said it, and what was going on. And when you read through the Gospels, there are so many instances where this is the case. Comparatively, we can look at the creation and how God moved to create the world, create the environment, create the rules of nature and science. And there's so many aspects that can be pointed out that point to God, point to the nature of God, and some of the thinking and plans and reasonings and intentions of God. And it could take forever to see it. You could grow into an old man and you may see things that you never saw before in nature and the scriptures, and it looks like it's as plain as day, and you never saw it before. Likewise, when you go beyond creation, particularly to the spiritual pursuits that God is entertaining with man, you begin to see these nuances in what he's doing, why he's doing, when he did it, and what was said to draw attention to that. Oftentimes, when you look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as well as John, a lot of these clarifications are brought out with prophecy that was directed to Christ, or prophecy that would show that Christ was the Messiah. There are certainly instances there where you could see this taking place. But then there are many other times where you see this taking place as well, and you may not have recognized it before or have been privy to it. And today I wanted to touch on a couple of those instances where that may have happened. And one example where such a thing takes place, we find in John chapter 7 and verse 37. John chapter 7 and in verse 37. And here we are breaking into a narrative. And we're at the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles for the first century peoples of Judea and Christ. And at the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles, we're in the narrative embarking on the beginning of the 8th day, the last great day, the final holy day of God that represents when all mankind would be resurrected and presented with the knowledge and the explanation of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. That understanding of learning and right and wrong versus how to couple following God with that. The understanding of salvation, the access to God's Spirit that would alter and manipulate the way a man, a woman, full adult or child would think so that they could become like God and born into the reflection of God as a spirit being, which is the ultimate destination of all humanity. Such a thing would be explained in the final culmination of human development, which is pictured by the last great day, this holy day. And so when I say the beginning, we're looking at the beginning of the last great day. The way the Jews see their day beginning, it's in the evening. When we say the beginning of the day, we're thinking in the morning. I'm talking about the evening. So here we are, the last great day, the final holy day. In the evening, we find Christ expressing these sentiments in John chapter 7 and verse 37. Still, background information is needed. Throughout the course of the Feast of Tabernacles, there was a ceremony or a custom that the Jews would keep. Some refer to it as a water ceremony. Amongst us, it has been mentioned by more than one person several times over the years in referring to this water ceremony. And in this ceremony, each day of the Feast of Tabernacles, the priest would, would walk down to a pool of water called the Pool of Siloam. And water would be gathered in a large jar. And this water would be brought back to the temple, to the altar in the temple. And the priest would be followed by an ensemble of people singing praises, playing music, I believe. And this water would be poured into a large bowl that would be at the foot of the altar, right before or in accordance with the morning sacrifice. And this would be done every day during the Feast of Tabernacles. This ceremony was a reminder to the Jews that in the 40 years of wandering, that God had provided water for them. In addition, it was also a recognition that one day God would pour out his Spirit to all peoples in the future. And so this water ceremony was something that would have occurred for the first 7 days in the morning every day. And so on the 8th day, that evening, that ceremony had culminated. The performance of doing this every day had ended. And this is where we find Christ expressing what he is expressing in John chapter 7. John chapter 7 and verse 37. On the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." And John then has an explanation that he adds. When I say John, the Apostle John is continuing to write an explanation to the reader to what he's saying. By this he meant the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. He had not been crucified yet, and resurrected, and returned to the right hand of the Father to now disseminate this Spirit, which was what was planned all along. And that's what John is clarifying. However, when we look at what Christ is saying, keep in mind what I was explaining before. There seems to be intention to the things that he does, the things that he did, when he did it, how he did it, why he did it, and at what time he did it. And when you look now at the context or the backdrop of what I already explained, now it makes more sense, particularly to those that would have been listening to him at that time. They would have been familiar with what transpired the first week with the water ceremony. Every day water was being gathered and poured out. So they were already in this water vibe. Whereas when we come and read it, we wouldn't associate it with anything because we've lost touch and been disconnected with that other aspect. And Christ invited anyone who is thirsty to come and drink. Keep in mind, it isn't about water. It isn't about being thirsty as I stop and take a sip. Christ is referring to the Holy Spirit that would be disseminated for all humanity in what this day, the day he was speaking on, pictures that last great day when the resurrection of all humanity would stand back up. And now it puts in the context why he's saying that. On the heels of this water ceremony, why he would express it in this way. And again, he continued, "Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." Meaning, as he continues with the plan that he and God the Father had set in motion, as he continues with his mission from the perspective of what he had accomplished thus far in that moment, on that day, when he was talking, he would later go on to be crucified and seen and used as the Passover sacrifice, which would atone or pay the ransom or the death penalty for all humanity, making it so that all humanity could have contact and be re-engaged with God the Father, whereby they would gain and be offered access to God's Spirit so that they'd be able to think and act like God, have their minds transformed and behave like God, and be changed from flesh into spirit, ultimately born into the family of God because of Christ's efforts. Here in New York, and I'm sure in other areas, there are programs that seek to provide individuals that may not have the means, that may be disenfranchised, that may have disabilities and other shortcomings, whereby they would not have access to certain things. These programs seek to provide individuals with phones. Many times, these phones are referred to as Obama phones because President Obama began an initiative where phones would be handed out at no cost to individuals in certain situations with certain life settings, certain predicaments. And so people that would pursue that or seek to gain that would be looking forward to gaining access to an Obama phone so they'd be able to use it in their day-to-day lives and help with some of the difficulties they have just getting by. Because keep in mind, these may be people that may not have been able to access or gain access to a phone for whatever reason. Financial problems, employment, eligibility, status in terms of having papers or being a citizen. You know, these are some of the individuals that, at least here in New York, that the program would seek to aid. And so, here you have an individual that's cut off, for all extents and purposes, from the world to some extent. They don't have a phone. They can't communicate with the outside world. But when they are given this phone, they now have access to things that they didn't have access to before. Access to their families, access to employment opportunities, but access nonetheless. Likewise, because of Christ's sacrifice, because of what he did, because of these waters, because of these living waters that he's referring to, representing his spirit, mankind would now have access to understanding and abilities and being able to plan one's future and being assumed and adopted into the family of God. Now, please understand and recognize, one, having this ability, having this understanding, having this access to God's Spirit is not solely for the purpose of trivia. Now you can understand stuff that you couldn't understand before. And maybe because of God's Spirit, you may be able to answer some Bible questions that your neighbor can't. It's more than that. Way more than that. It's about implementing this in the way that you live and think, truly transforming who you are. You ever see people change for whatever reason? Before they used to drink and party, and now they stop drinking and partying. They're boring now, right? What if they were drinking and partying to dereliction? That's not good. And so that change is considered a positive. And so this change that we experience, it's a positive. Also, on another note, many times when we approach this concept of change, it's along the lines of, because you are a scumbag and you're a bum, you need to change. You're a bad person. And every week you got to be reminded of how horrible you are. You need to change the way you think. You need to change the way you act. You have all these bad qualities and you have all these bad impulses. Horrible, horrible person. Akin to how many Americans address their dog when their dog fails to reach the level of expectations of their owner. Bad dog. Bad dog. Bad layperson. Bad churchgoer. Bad. That's not what we're doing either. Not at all. Yes, it is imperative, it is important to recognize your status. A man needs to know his limitations. However, you're not going to beat a dead horse. We're not trying to beat ourselves down. Yes, recognize your limitations. Recognize your standing, particularly in how you relate to God. As many people often tell their children, Respect your parents. Respect me when you approach me and interact with me, but at the same time, dialogue should be open when you approach your parents, your father, your mother, if you have that kind of relationship with them. And likewise, when we approach God, this isn't a guilt trip every Saturday. So let's get that clear as well. However, change is still mandatory, encouraged, and sought after. The freshman in college isn't considered a bad person, and they're going to change after 4 years of school, and they seek to get a job with whatever degree they attain. They're not looked at as they're a bad person, but they change, and that change is sought after. I went to the hospital many times the last couple of weeks. Each time I walked in, I didn't think of myself as a bad person, but I had every intention of changing. Y'all better come on with that medicine, with that treatment, hurry up. Needles, don't care for them. Drawing my blood multiple times, don't care for it. However, the extreme pain that I was feeling was so great, y'all better come on and draw my blood, come on and stick me with those needles. Because the pain they were offering was less than the pain I was feeling. The pain they were offering was temporary compared to the pain that I was feeling that appeared to be ongoing. I want that pain, Mr. Doctor, Mr. Nurse, that doesn't know what she's doing and can't find the vein. Hurry up. I'll feel that pain instead. Likewise, when we approach God and we look to change and we look to recognize who and what we are now, and we look to avoid or outskirt or pull away from the pains and difficulties that we are presently already feeling, or the pains we very well may be promised for failing to obey God, we will opt for the struggles and challenges, dare I say, minimal pains that come along with pursuing God. Yes? Everybody with me? Listen, if you're going to fall asleep, I'm going to fall asleep too. Ladies and gentlemen, watching online right now or watching at home, I often make comments about the condition and reception of my audience. And dare I say, they're doing it again and they need to be prodded. Now, you guys at home may not have these issues. And if you do, I'm unaware and I can't see it. But everybody here in the audience, you guys are with me? Yes. All right. And so, seeing how the context of how Christ was speaking and the way Christ was speaking influenced what he was saying, we continue to see the importance and the value of that water that he spoke of, representing his spirit. And we see this continuously throughout the Bible. If we turn to Isaiah, we see further this elaboration, this comparison. In Isaiah chapter 12 and in verse 1, in that day you will say, I will praise you, Lord, although you were angry with me. Your anger has turned away, and you have comforted me. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The Lord himself, is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. The Jews, as they practiced this water ceremony that Christ was referring to and speaking on the heels of, would use this scripture as a defense of why they were doing what they were doing. And this is how they thought. And they saw themselves as drawing from this water, these wells of salvation. Salvation meaning the betterment of an individual, the ultimate good of an individual, the removal of impoverishment and any discrepancies about an individual that were lacking in them. It was the complete manifestation of perfection, the pursuit of salvation. That's what that is. And many will say, perfection is unattainable. That's not true. With Christ's sacrifice, such an endeavor is now possible because Christ has paid for our sins. We didn't pay for it ourselves, but it puts us in a position where now sin is not imputed to us. And in that moment, at that moment, as far as God is concerned, you're perfect. And as Satan stands before God the Father and Christ, oh, come on. That's not fair. What are you doing? This stands true for us. Satan would disagree and feel that undue, unfair treatment is being handed down to us. And you know what? He's got a point. We don't deserve this. You're going to see a lot of these themes repeated and brought out again in the next couple of months as we approach Passover. We look at Satan as just straight up liar, which he is. Yes. But sometimes he says things that are true. We don't deserve this. Continuing on, turning over to Isaiah 44. Isaiah 44 and in verse 3. For I will pour water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my spirit on your offspring and my blessings on your descendants. They will spring up like grass in the meadow, like poplar trees by flowing streams. Some will say, I belong to the Lord. Others will call themselves by the name of Jacob. Still others will write on their hand the Lord's and will take the name Israel. In the future, when this water, God's Spirit, becomes more and more available, more accessible, more attained, more implemented, this is the way people will think. And suddenly they're on Team God. When they weren't on Team God before, we could look at our day and time now. How many are really on Team God? You have some that say that, but they don't practice it. They don't live it. Also, it's hard to view some of these things from the lens of first world problems. I always talk about this. We got first world problems. So when we look at water, it's just water. It's plentiful. It's everywhere because we have it like that. Peoples throughout history have not always had it like that. And so water was highly valued in terms of how it promoted and progressed life. It fueled your farms and your crops. Again, we don't know anything about crops because food doesn't originate in the ground in the first world country. Food originates at the store. What's wrong with you? How do you not know this? And that's the mentality of many people because that's our life. But take the moment to recognize how needed, how important this water is, and then understand the comparison to God's Spirit. Turning back to John chapter 4. John chapter 4, in verse 7. Here we find Christ speaking with a Samaritan woman. Let's start in verse 4. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Recognize how Jews saw Samaria, how Jews saw Samaritans. Once upon a time, back when the Babylonians had conquered Judea, Israel had previously been conquered by Assyria, and they were long gone, had not returned, and lost. The Judeans have been taken over and conquered by the Babylonians. And as time goes on, a remnant of the people returned. Prior to their returning, there were occasions where the ruling powers that dealt with the land that had now been left vacant, they had imported individuals to take care of the grounds, till the grounds so that it just didn't become a wasteland. Try to make the best of the area. And if there was any produce or anything that could be gleaned from the area, that would, of course, would be sent back to the imperial country. And so what happened was, as people were sent back to the lands that had been vacated, foreigners were sent back to the lands that were vacated, they began to have problems in the immediate area. They were very superstitious, and so they would have problems with the wildlife. The animals would come and eat them. They would have difficulties perhaps with the weather. And so word was sent back to the imperialistic country, listen, we're having a problem. Can you send us some information about the previous gods of the land, of the area, so we could pray to those gods and reach out to those gods so they would help us out in our adjustment here. And so who would they refer to? Who did they send back as counsel? With the former Israelites or the former Judeans that had been taken out of the land, that were taken out because of idolatry. They weren't living right to begin with. So they send back the nutty professor. They send back the person that's understanding and their concept of religion and worship and approach to God was already warped and tainted. And so the people that were there, that had been placed there, began to take this religion, take this understanding, merge it with their own, merge it with some of the surrounding areas' religion, and they came to be known as the Samaritans. And as time went on, these people practiced this hybrid version of a Judeo paganistic type religion. And the Jews looked at them with scorn, because the Samaritans were thinking, hey, we're Jews too. You know, we recognize to some degree the Sabbath as well, and we have a synagogue as well here in on our side of the land. And they weren't recognized or accepted. And so this view was still existent in the first century. Samaritans were not deemed highly at all. And you could look at some of the parables, and the parable of, I don't remember what that parable would be called. And the story consisted around a gentleman that was traveling, and he gets jumped, attacked, mugged, and nobody helped him. The people that you would think would help him didn't help him. Anybody have a name for this parable?
Good Samaritan.
The Good Samaritan. Who would have thought? Okay, thank you guys. So it turns out, if you're not familiar with this story, you know, the priest walks by, and he didn't help. There's all these other individuals that had a certain standing in the community that you would have thought for sure they would help. And nobody helped but the Samaritan, the lowly Samaritan. The Samaritan, the individuals that in their day they would call them dogs. It's the only individual that helped. So this is their view of Samaritans. And so here we have Christ and his disciples now going through the Samaritan area en route to a Jewish area that they're going to. Remember, Christ's attitude during this period of time was that he was sent to the 12 tribes of Israel, not to the pagans, not to anyone else outside of the Jews. And he, for the most part, he stuck to that unless he was really, really pressed. And so here we find, for whatever reason, he's walking through a Samaritan area, and it must have been at last resort for whatever reason. Maybe they were short on time, but they decided to walk through this area. Verse 6, Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. And as you continue to read the story, it appears that he sat there as his disciples probably went into town to go get food to bring back. And Christ just may have been too fatigued to keep up or to take on that trip. Verse 7. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? One, this lady is coming to draw water at 12 noon, way late in the day. Now, that may not seem like a big deal to us in the States, but for many of you that are from Other areas are outside the country or tropical areas of the Caribbean. You know full well you set out to go do big things at 12 o'clock noon. It is too hot to be out doing anything. Most Americans can't understand this degree of heat, but in other areas it gets hot, and it is very hot at 12. So much so, from what I understand, many government jobs in the Caribbean begin their day real early so they can end early because it just gets too hot. Now, Americans might find that acceptable to get off at, say, 11 a.m., but we're going to show up late to work. We're not showing up at 3 in the morning. We're going to show up at 8 or 9 o'clock, but we like to getting off at 11 a.m. like they may do in other governments. Well, whatever the case, why is this lady coming at 12 o'clock to get water? Most women would be, and it would be the women of the house that would usually do this, would come out in the morning to gather water, early in the morning before the heat. She may be scorned or disenfranchised herself to come out at 12 when everybody else is gone. And we do learn that she has certain aspects about her life that may give her ridicule. Hence, she's coming out at 12 to get water in this heat. Secondly, I told you about how Jews viewed Samaritans. Not only did they view them with disdain, they didn't talk to them. Not only did they not talk to them, a Jewish man definitely would not talk to a Samaritan woman beneath him. So you have all these rules being broken. So Jesus asks this lady for water, and she's taken aback because he's speaking to her. That would never happen. You ever see these movies where these very awkward guys are able to win over the prettiest, most attractive, drop-dead gorgeous woman or girl in their scope, in their fear, in their circle of friends? It's just like, all right, this is not normal. Why is this happening? Do you ever walk through the mall and see the most demure of men with the most beautiful of women? And you think, he got money. It's like, what's going on? That doesn't make sense. But if you see it in reverse, the other way, where you see a really cool guy with a very demure woman, she's got a really nice personality, right? We understand the social norms of our day. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to point out social norms of our day in comparison to the first century. I'm not making a knock on demure women or demure guys. So, that being said, she's taken aback that he's speaking to her. Will you give me a drink? And then we have John explaining. His disciples had gone into town to buy food. Verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? And John explains, for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So again, she knows that the norms were being broken. Like, what's going on? Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And here we go again. Christ is on this water thing. He's always pushing water, which is representative of his spirit. Yes. And this is his mindset. And even as he talks to the Samaritan woman, this is the frame of mind that he's in. He's just like totally on this aquatic thing. Like, what's wrong? But people were not understanding the meaning. Sir, the woman said, taking him literally. Like, why not? I'm going to entertain this guy. You have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock? Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Again, explaining the process that would occur when he finished his mission. And instead of going, listen, lady, I'm on a mission, and I'm gonna get tortured real bad. I happen to have royal stock, royal lineage, and I'm the son of God. And when all of this is done, my life is going to pay for the sins of all humanity. And when I go back home, and I can't wait to go back home, when I go back home, I'm going to send this Spirit back for all humanity to use, and they're going to implement it. And in the future, everyone is going to have the opportunity to be born into the family of God. Her response would have been, crazy. And he does not speak this way. Instead, he speaks in a more poetic means. Can we look and see if the live stream is up? And so, this is the approach that Christ is using and the manner in which he's using as he expresses himself. And if any of you are having difficulty with the live stream, perhaps you may seek other means going to cgi.org or cginewyork.org or Facebook, CGI Facebook, which you could also get on the CGI page, or CGI YouTube, which is CGI Digital Network 3 for the New York version. Continuing on. Verse 15, the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." She's taking him literally when Christ was talking spiritually. And as their conversation proceeds, he has to try to draw her back to the way that he's thinking. And eventually she gets it and recognizes that he's a prophet. And then he becomes even more blunt, as I was alluding to, that he indeed was the Messiah. Yes. And so this little digression turned into 2 days. And he spent time with them, and Samaritans entertained him, and they listened to him. And get this, as he did this, you don't see an account of a zillion miracles being done, which is what the Jews demanded. Yes. And he got quite frustrated. But no, he was just able to speak from his own authority, and they listened. No tricks, no magic tricks, no miracles. And these are Samaritans, lowly Samaritans, scum of the earth. And they listened without any fuss. Whereas the Jews, show me a trick. And now look at that contrast. Nevertheless, the emphasis on how God is looking to share his Spirit with mankind. Jeremiah chapter 17, and reading from the New Living Translation, Jeremiah recounts, "O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who turn away from you will be disgraced. They will be buried in the dust of the earth, for they have abandoned the Lord, the fountain of living water." Yes. Even in the Old Testament, from the point of view of Christ's conversation with the Samaritan, now going back 2,500, 3,000 years, Christ, as a human being who formerly was the Word in the Old Testament, speaking to Jeremiah, still obsessed with all of these aquatics, speaking of this fountain of living water. In Jeremiah, again, chapter 17, I'm going to read from the NIV. Jeremiah 17, verse 13. "Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water." This living water isn't just water, but again, recognize the importance of water. To us, it's nothing, first world problems. Water is everywhere. We waste it, we let it run, we play with it. We have parks where we fill it with water and just jump around in it. We wash our dogs and cats in it. like it's just that plentiful. We do whatever. But in the past, people recognized the importance of water to their livelihood. And this spring of living water, which is being attributed to who God is, what God is mentioned again in Revelation 21, where we see the end of the story, where the good guys win and everything works out, but we see the end result of what that water will do. Just like in the example I gave, that change that the freshman goes through after 4 years of college when they graduate, they changed into a person with greater access, greater abilities, greater pursuits and interest. I talked about how a person goes to the hospital looking for change, to be made well. And when they leave the hospital with dreams of being better than what they were when they came, and having that come to fruition days later after their treatment. And not for nothing, I feel like I'm able to talk better than I was last week. I wasn't feeling too great. And not for nothing, you guys look just as sleepy as I continue to speak. Now, how come I changed and you guys didn't? Come on now, cut it out. How are you guys feeling? I don't believe you. Everyone at home, they claim to be feeling great. But I don't know. Room's a little quiet. You keep it up, I'm going to ask the engineer to put on. They say they're paying attention. But if you keep it up, I'm going to ask the engineer to put on some music while I'm talking. Nevertheless, we see how God is identified as this fountain of living water, this spring of water, and what that water can do and will do in representing God's Spirit, what it does to humanity. And we see that playing out at the end of the story in Revelation 21, verse 6. Here we have John, the Apostle John, being spoken to as he takes dictation and notes on what he's seeing. He said to me, "It is done." Christ speaking to him. Now the high priest, now the resurrected Christ, now the first of first fruits, primarily known, formerly known as the Word. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. And here we find something that is figurative and literal at the same time. Figurative in that this water is representative of God's Spirit and the changes that it will have made by this point in time where all humanity has been transformed and translated into spirit beings. When salvation from human to spirit being has been completed. Figurative in that sense as referring to God's Spirit, this water. Literal in the sense that this is literal liquid that these beings will now be able to drink of. Representative of all that had transpired in the former and past 6,000 years of man's development. And it's recognizing that man is undergoing this development. For the last 6,000 years, he's been allowed to go this way. John chapter 6 makes recognition of that. And as mankind goes this way and is allowed to suffer the things that he suffers as a learning experience, because the story won't end here, doesn't end here, but with the limited understanding that many may have, or with the limited understanding that only our sight will expound to us, it looks like things aren't working out very well. But with the understanding that we have, we know there's more. We understand the salvation and the plan of God. When you read the news, boy, there's some stories that are so troublesome. I remember an account right in the middle of that war that started with Israel and the Palestinians. And I understand both sides, particularly coming from the viewpoint that we come from and understanding what God is doing. But when you watch people fight, boy, they sure do beat the heck out of each other. They really do. And there was an account of how a family, Palestinian family, had gotten caught in the crossfires of some fighting. And they're just getting shot in their vehicle. And the children were, I guess, calling whoever they could, calling family members. And the family members, all they could do was hear how the kids are getting shot. So first a teenager gets shot, and they died. And then you just left with the 3 or the 4-year-old giving an account of what's transpiring as they are getting shot. And it was just very sad. And again, I'm recounting this story with an attempt to be neutral, because the Palestinians, they're suffering, but so are the Israelis. It's just, and it isn't just in that jurisdiction. It isn't just in that area. People are fighting and suffering everywhere. And it becomes a geopolitical thing, a geopolitical stance. And there's all of these political viewpoints. And one may go, we're sending money overseas. We got problems right here in the States, right here in this community. There are problems everywhere. And so this is so widespread as an extinction of humanity being allowed to go their own way and deal with the knowledge of good and evil on their own until God is ready to step in and go, all right, see, that didn't work out, did it? Now this is what you do, which is what that last great day pictures, which is why Christ was saying, whoever thirst, not whichever of you Jews thirst, whoever thirst. He was speaking at large to all humanity. John chapter 6, verse 53. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in them. And we understand the symbolism behind this as we approach the Passover, and that Christ offered his body as a sacrifice and a ransom to pay the penalty of sin for us, so we could have a relationship with God, so we could have access to God's Spirit. And we commemorate this by eating the bread, symbolizing his body, and drinking the wine, symbolizing his blood that was spilled. Just as the living Father sent me and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. Continuing on, dropping down to verse 60. On hearing it, many of the disciples said, this is hard teaching. Who can accept it? Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? Because not everybody can understand what's going on. Just like throughout the 6,000 years, many go, where's God? This doesn't make sense. Not everybody's going to understand, but a select few will. Then Christ continues, what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of spirit and life. There's meaning behind what he's saying. When these things are implemented, using their symbolic form, and actually implemented in how we live and what we do and go through these ceremonies, and Christ's Spirit is afforded to us, most certainly after he had accomplished what he needed to, these things become realistic. They become attainable, and hence, they are full of the Spirit and of life. Christ continues, yet there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. Verse 65, he went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. Not everybody is enabled. Not everyone is going to understand these things. Not everyone is going to understand where is God during these 6,000 years. Not everyone is going to understand God's obsession with water, God's obsession with aquatics. There's meaning behind that. That water is valuable. When we understand what that means and how that represents His Spirit, we want that Spirit. We need to utilize that Spirit. That Spirit has value. And that Spirit, as Christ said, turns into life.
Amen.
But not everyone is enabled to understand that. At least not now. And so the time is coming where people will be further enabled. And we see Moses in his psalm. What's the Psalm of Moses? Is it 99? 90. It's 90. In that psalm, Moses acknowledges that a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And when you look at the first several chapters of Genesis, in the week of creation, that's more than a child's Bible story. Each day is a symbolic representation of 6,000 years that man has been allowed to go his own way. And that has more meaning than what may initially meet the eye. Man indeed has had 6,000 years to contemplate, or what will turn out to be contemplation, when they are given further understanding and they look back on their experience. Contemplate going their own way versus pursuing the way of God using this water, this Spirit. Matthew 9 in verse 16, we see the changing aspect of this Spirit. Matthew 9, verse 16. And Christ, after he's being challenged by John the Baptist's disciples, like, how come your disciples, they don't behave in the way that John the Baptist has us behaving? You guys don't fast. You don't approach things the same way that we do. And as you read the Gospels and you go into Acts, you begin to see a difference in how the disciples of Christ would behave and how the disciples of John would behave, particularly individuals that were just familiar with the teachings of John the Baptist but not of Christ. And I always say, we aren't able to see how popular and how impactful John's influence was, that 20, 30, 40 years later, people are still influenced by what John the Baptist said, and they may not have heard of Christ yet or been familiar with his teachings, but they were still following John the Baptist's protocols, ways, and teachings. But there is a difference. There's a difference. John the Baptist was meant to show individuals or alert individuals about Christ. He wasn't the last stop. He was meant to proclaim Christ. He was the show opener. He was never the headliner. He was the one that came out to get the crowd hype. He was the one that came out and told jokes. He was the musician of lesser popularity, lesser influence, lesser talent-wise, that came out to perform before the headliner, the one you paid your $25, $50, $100 to $400 a ticket for to come see. He was just the opening act, meant to draw attention to the opening act, to Christ's message, to Christ's delivery of the new covenant, to Christ's emphasis and focus on the spirit aspects of pursuing God as opposed to the ceremonial, legal aspects of pursuing God, which John the Baptist still would entail, because everybody was stuck on going to the temple. Everybody was stuck on worship originating and associated with the temple, not with being the temple themselves, not with having God's Spirit within them. And when the temple fell, it's like, okay, now what? Now what? Now what do we do? How do you pursue religion without a temple? And that they had a disconnect because they never switched over. Those were the ones that had a hard time. And then you see Paul in his writings constantly trying to get people to understand we've switched over to a different plan now. We're on high definition. We're on stereo. We're not monologue. We're not just using regular television signals. And so we see this in Christ's answer and response in Matthew 9, verse 16. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. And if you read this and you're not familiar with how things work, or your home economic skills aren't very high, you don't get it. And for those of you who don't know what the heck I'm talking about, back in the day, home economics was a class you took at school, and it meant to teach you how to be domestic, how to keep a house. I guess it was meant for the young men and the young women, but you go back into the 40s and the 50s, there was more of a chauvinistic view that society had, and not entirely chauvinistic, but I guess the family dynamics were also different. And so you learned how to sew and cook and do things like that, and you would come across this concept as well. You take a new patch of clothing and you sew it on an old piece of clothing. It's like when you buy a new sweater and you can't wait to put it on and look spiffy and go out and impress. If you wash it first or you wash it after, if you are ignorant to these things, as I once upon a time was, you may have your mom's or one of your lady friends tell you, your sweater's gonna shrink. I was like, what? What are you talking about? It's gonna shrink. Did you wash it yet? No, I didn't. Well, it's gonna shrink. And then you go and wash it. Don't let you wash it in hot water. Man, it comes out, looks like a child's toy. Man, I spent $50 on this sweater, and it shrinks. Now picture that sweater was a patch of material, and you tried to close up a hole by sewing that patch onto an old piece of clothing. The clothing itself had already been washed. It's not gonna shrink. But that patch hadn't shrunk yet. And so when you wash it, or eventually in time, that clothing, that new patch is gonna shrink. And as it contracts, it's gonna pull along the hole that you're trying to close up, and it's gonna tear, it's gonna rip. And that's what Christ is talking about. Apparently, he was fluent in home economics 2,000 years before whatever period home economics would take place for you. He continues on to make the same kind of analogy. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. And you may not understand how that would be either if you don't have a lot of exposure to wineskins. And if you are using bottles and containers to house your liquids or your wine, well, you're missing out. And I don't understand how you don't preserve a couple of wine skins in the basement or in your fridge to test this out on. But nevertheless, if you had some wine skins, what would wine skins be made of? You guys can answer. Leather?
Yep.
But leather's a cow. Yes? So it's made out of cow? Goat? Making wineskins out of goat? No? All right, we're stuck on cow, AKA leather. But we're gonna keep it first century. So, cow. All right, so when you would take this material and you would put wine in it that was fermented and that had alcohol in it, if the wine skins had expanded already and it was old, it would have already expanded. But if you put wine in new wineskins, it hadn't expanded yet, like the clothing. Once you wash it, it's going to shrink. Well, this wineskin now in the opposite direction is going to expand. And so again, to clarify and say it correctly, you pour new wine into old wineskin. The old wineskin is expanded as much as I guess it can at that point. The fermentation, the alcohol of the wine makes the wine expand. Like when your milk rots, that the container expands. The fermentation of it, it makes the container grow. And so in a wineskin, once it grew, it would grow to the point that it would burst. It didn't have room to expand. Whereas the new wineskins could grow with the wine. It moved along the same pace. And this was the understanding that they had then. The point Christ was trying to make was, there's a new sheriff in town. Things are different. There's a new way to approach things. There's a spiritual component and approach as opposed to the legalistic ceremonial approach. And in answering specifically the followers of John the Baptist, who were more grounded in and connected to religious life with the temple, religious life with some of the aspects of the culture then. And they couldn't grasp the understanding of a new approach using God's Spirit that Christ was implementing and how man would seek to find God and approach God. Likewise, when we look at the water transforms, the water changes, and it changes so many things, the way that we think, the way that we behave. It changes what we are going to become from flesh to spirit. We will grow, we will expand, and we grow and expand outside of the confines of what we were before. And I mentioned that earlier about changing. You change, the college student, the freshman changes. It's not the same when he graduates. The sick person, when they leave the hospital, they change, hopefully for the better. When they leave, that's the ideal, that's the goal. There's an expansion, there's a change. And like these wineskins, like the patch of clothing, there's a change initiated by this water, by this Spirit. There's a change that's represented by the blood of Christ that we drink, by the bread that we eat, reflective of Christ's body. And when we see Christ talking of these things and speaking of these things, at the point in time that he does it, there's a reason why. There was a reason why he spoke of that on the last great day. And there are many occasions when we see these reasons why he does what he does. Last week, we spoke about how he cleansed the temple and chased the money changers out. But the point in time in which he did it, there was a reason why. So everything seems to have a point and an intent with what Christ is doing. Matthew 26 and verse 27. Matthew 26 and verse 27. And we see Christ at the meal prior to his crucifixion. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." This point will be driven home as we approach the Passover. This recognition of a covenant that is now spiritual as opposed to physical, with spiritual promises as opposed to physical promises. And these are the pursuits that we are chasing. John chapter 2, we see another example of place and time, why Christ is saying what he's saying when he's saying it. We see an example of God's continuing obsession with water and the understanding of the Spirit, the meaning behind the blood of Christ, the new covenant, and what that means and what that entails, the change from flesh to spirit, the change in our mind from the way that we think, the growth that takes place, like the patches of clothing or the new wineskins, the expansion of who we are. We see all of that in this narrative. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. The third day from when, if you read the previous chapter, Christ went on a pursuit of travel. And this third day of travel, he is now going to a wedding taking place in Cana in Galilee. Christ was from Nazareth. Back in the first century, when you had a wedding, the whole village came. The whole village was invited. Not just the whole village, even outside of your village, your family members, your friends would come. That's a lot of people. Understand, when you look at the disciples and you look at many of the people that we are familiar with in the Bible, we think these are a whole bunch of strangers getting together. Not always the case. Many times these people knew each other. They were related. Oh, that's my cousin. My uncle does that. They were all related, but when you read the Bible, you don't read, oh, that's Christ's cousin. it doesn't say that, and in fact, that may be the case. You don't read that this disciple is related to that disciple and their brothers. Not all the time. And so you may miss that. Point being, when everyone has all of these associations, and they're from similar communities in the same community, they are therefore invited to this wedding, and hence why all these people are going, why everyone is showing up at this wedding. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. She was already there. It appears she's involved in this wedding, in the planning. Who knows how they knew the couple that was getting married. But as we mentioned, the whole village comes, and then people from outside the area. Christ is from Nazareth. Cana is believed to be 5 to 9 miles north of Nazareth. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Again, everybody's from the same area, same community. When the wine was gone, all right, that prepositional phrase right there, we already got a problem. The wine is gone, which would be a downer if you were having a party. But all you need is to go on a beer run. Not possible. So you can't run to the store to get beer. This is a very big event, and there may be hundreds to thousands of people at this wedding. In the first century, it was the responsibility of the bridegroom to have certain amenities present, and wine was one of them. To run out of wine was a horrific social, how do you pronounce this? Faux pas? Did I say that right? What is that, French? Yes. All right. Listen, guys, stop playing around. We're almost finished, and only one person answered me. It was a major disgrace. It was a horrific disgrace to have this happen. It would last you years into your marriage to have that take place. And it's hard for us to understand. And I can't quite think of another level of disgrace that we could relate to. But it was something that, oh no, we can't have this happen. And so Christ's mother comes to Jesus to tell him, these guys ran out of wine. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Again, the statement, the implication is not like, oh, by the way, they're out of wine. The implication is do something. Do something, not just like, I've been around you for 30 years, I've raised you, I've seen you do some weird stuff. I know you could help out. It was more than that. It was like, listen, you are 30 years old. You're supposed to be the Messiah. Can we get this going? Show everybody who you are. Show them what you could do. So let's start now. When are you going to start? What are you waiting for? There was a degree of prodding in this, and that's the implication. Christ's response, woman, why do you involve me? Scholars have a hard time translating this. One, he calls his mother woman. It is not in a derogatory sense. It is not meant that way when you look at how it is translated from the Greek or the Aramaic. It's not an insult. When we hear that and we go, oh, wow, you would not talk to your moms that way. Or like, woman. This is woman maybe on the kin of man or ma'am, or my dear woman, or the way you would call a man sir. This isn't Ike Turner anime woman. It's not that level. And again, many of you may not even get that reference. It's not a chauvinistic type of barking at someone. And that's a shame. You guys should be ashamed of yourselves. Do you guys know who Ike Turner is? Yes. Only a few of you. Yeah. Mr. Giovia, do you know who Ike Turner is? Anyway, so Ike Turner was once a popular musician And Anna Mae was his wife, but she's more so known as Tina Turner. And Ike Turner was very abusive, and it was well known, and it was very open. And so this kind of exchange was kind of understood by many, where that kind of verbiage and treatment would be displayed. That is not what Christ is doing when he says woman. So understand that. The next part, why do you involve me? That phrase is an idiom. It's a phrase from the Hebrew, a Semitic phrase. It's a phrase from the Hebrew that is being said in Greek and then translated from Greek into this. And literally, it means, what is it to you and to me? That's the literal translation. What is it to you and to me? And what the translators try to do is they translate the meaning as opposed to the literal translation. And even in this room, there are many people from the Caribbean, and they use phrases. It makes no sense to me. The Jamaicans and the Trinidadians don't understand either one of these phrases. And it's like, what? What are you talking about? It doesn't make sense. But then they translate the meaning, and then I go, oh, okay, I get it. But only after the meaning is translated. But when it's just said in and of itself, I don't understand. And vice versa. If I do it to you, you won't get it either. If I use phrases from my Ebonics and so forth, you're like, what are you talking about? And so that's the challenge, translating that phrase. And so what may this mean? Many translate it on the side of it's an expression of some degree of disengagement, meaning that's not my problem. That's not, what is that, how does that involve you or me with what's going on? That's too bad, they ran out of wine. Yeah, they're gonna look pretty bad, not my issue. Some may use that translation, because that is one, disengagement. Another one would be a little bit more contentious, and it's a sense of, why are you putting me in this position? Which is considered more aggressive. And most go, yeah, Christ couldn't have meant that. He wasn't being aggressive. He wasn't being contentious. When you look at how it's used in other areas of the Bible, you see the same exact phrase used. What to you and to me. You see it in Judges chapter 11, verse 12, where one of the judges, Jephthah, is writing to the king of the Ammonites because the king of the Ammonites attacked Israel. And he's like, what to you and to me? Why are you attacking us? What's going on? What did I do to you? Why are you doing this? We didn't do anything to you. And it turns out the Ammonites were attacking the Israelites for an old grievance years ago, which is why the judge was like, what to you and to me? Like, why are you doing this? Another example, 2 Chronicles 35, verse 21, where Pharaoh of Egypt was trying to attack the Babylonians, but they had to go through Judah to do so. And King Josiah of Judah opposed him, confronted him, wouldn't let his troops pass through Judah to get to Babylon. And the Pharaoh of Egypt writes a letter to King Josiah, what to you and to me? Like, dude, why are you doing this? I'm not even after you. I'm not bothering you. I'm trying to go fight Babylon. I just got to go through your country. And if you read the story, the Pharaoh was like, your God told me to do this. I'm not even doing this on my own. And again, that same expression is used. And lastly, 1 Kings 17, verse 18, where Elijah goes to stay with a widow. And if you know the story, he does a number of miracles there. He makes food last a little bit longer. And then her son dies. And now she's associating Elijah coming to visit her and her son dying. And she says to him, what to you and to me? Like, bro, what are you doing? What did I do to you? You're going to come hang out in my house and my kid's going to die? What are you doing? And so that's how it's used in the Old Testament. And those are the ways it could be used in the New Testament. Or when you see it, the Hebrew translated into the Greek and then used in the Greek and translated into English. So the number of things that this could mean, I told you most translators translated on the side of disengagement. That's not my problem. Some of the other approaches to it could be Christ is going, one, woman, like recognizing, getting Mary's attention, not talking to you as my mother, but as a woman that's been fostering me because you raised me to be the Messiah. I am the Son of God. I'm God the Father's child. You now need to kind of step back and let me do what I need to do, as opposed to mothering and try to, oh, well, you know, my son needs a job. Can you hire him? You ever see people do stuff like that? Like, no, you can't get involved. I got to make these approaches. I got to do that. I now need to do my job. You can't do that. You can't start me and get me going and say, look, you need to get started, so now reveal yourself and begin your ministry. Like, you can't do that. And he would go on to say, my hour has not yet come, meaning it's not time for me to complete my mission and lay down my life, and there's still a number of things I got to do. And until I do that, you can't be in the way like this. Don't do that. Some may translate it or look to it in that manner. But whatever the case, however it was translated, for the most part, scholars use a degree of disengagement, and it's like, look, that's not my problem, which is how they translate it in most texts. And so as we go on, woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. It's not time for me to do that yet. It's not time for me to lay down my life yet. I still have many things to do before I lay down my life. And again, these are all the different translations or ways that this may come out. However it was meant, she seemed to have an understanding where she in turn goes to tell the servants what to do. So chances are it may not have been confrontational. He may not have been going, I don't want to do that. Maybe he was saying he was actually committed to doing that and okay with doing that. But you see the difficulty in translating a phrase from the first century. Verse 5, his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. And so, we have something that you see in the first century, where many Jewish homes will have these large water jars made of stone. This is relevant because the jars made of stone cannot be defiled, whereas the pottery jars can be defiled. If you look at history or you read about excavations and Jewish excavations, you will find a lot of times that pottery is broken. The Jews would drink from the pottery and then break it because they're done with it, because the pottery, for whatever reason, could become defiled later. And when they would have gatherings, they would break the jars, like the way we leave our paper cups behind. They would break their jars. But the stone jars, they will always stand as ceremonially clean. And so if you recall in Matthew 15, the Pharisees approached Christ and they're going, how come your disciples don't wash their hands? And that wasn't, kids come, dinner's ready, wash your hands. It wasn't that. It was, they would wash their hands. And by their washing their hands meant they were spiritually clean. By them washing their hands, it meant they were righteous. They were approved by God. That is not said in the Bible. That was man-made. And Christ was like, I'm not playing your stupid nonsense games. And that's why he wasn't all into the washing of the hands. That's what they were talking about. And Christ went on to say, what defiles a man comes from inside him, not washing of the hands. When you read that, he's like, yeah, if you got dirty hands, you could get sick. That's not what they were talking about. The Pharisees meant if you washed your hands, then it was a ceremony. It was a literal thing that they took from Leviticus to implement. And it really meant you were okay with God if you did that. And that's not true based on that. But a lot of Jewish families participated in this. They lived by this. And so here at this wedding, you had these jars that were used so people would wash their hands before they ate. And these jars were probably kept in another part of the house other than where people were. So now Christ tells them, fill those jars up, the jars that were used for ceremonial purification. Why did he pick those jars? Why didn't he just tell them, you ran out of wine? All right, where were you keeping the wine? Fill that up with water, alakazoo, boom. That's not what he did. He specifically goes use the ceremonial jars with water. Remember God's obsession with water. And there's 6 of them. Go figure. Why are there 6 jars? What does the water represent? What have we seen thus far? The water represents God's Spirit. And what does he do? He changes it into wine. Also representative of the blood of Christ, showing the power that he has as God, changing from flesh to spirit, changing mindsets from the physical law, temple, concentrated approach to God to a spiritual approach to God. These are the things that are implemented in that, and the need that man has for God's Spirit, this water that would change them. Remember, these jars were made of stone, so the water you put in it is ceremonially pure. The water you put in those jars are clean. The water you put in those jars are living water. There's living water in the jars. And he took 6 large jars, 6, representative of that spirit that man needs all throughout the 6,000 years of man's exposure to living his own way apart from God. But that water, that spirit, is one day going to bring all humanity of over those 6,000 years back to God in the same way we showed at the beginning of our talk on the last great day when Christ spoke of whoever's thirsty. And here we are again filling up jars with water, and he changes it into wine. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. So now they take it to the one in charge of the one leading the festivities. What do you call those people? A caterer? What's another word? The what? The waiter? No, this is higher. Maitre d'. This is way higher than waiter, but like a caterer. But what do you call those ladies? And that's their job. They do catering and stuff like that. No? That's their job. They do catering. What? No, higher than host. Okay, whatever the case. This is like a caterer. You would go and hire this person to do this at your wedding. Okay, we'll stick with caterer. Yeah, like a wedding planner, things like that. But there's another word even for catering. Anyway, so now they take the water. They did so. Continuing in verse 8. And the master of the banquet, the head caterer, I guess, tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside, and he said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. In the first century, you brought out the good wine, people drank the good wine, they got a little tipsy, then you bring out the weaker wine, they're not going to notice because they're already nice. And that's what the head caterer is saying. And he's going, but you did it in reverse. And then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best till now. The guy was really impressed because this was really some high-standing wine, high-quality wine, very expensive wine. And when you see what happened, the shame that was going to fall on the bridegroom did it. Now the bridegroom looks like the man. The head caterer did not know where it came from. The bridegroom may have known. The only ones that knew may have been the bridegroom and the bride, because they ran out of wine. The disciples knew because they watched this, and we'll see that it infected them because now they believed in Christ. And the servants knew because they saw what happened as Christ did it. And that's why you see, he did not realize, meaning the caterer, where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And when we look at the Spirit of God and the truth and the understanding, not everyone is drawn, everyone is called. God the Father draws people throughout this 6,000 years. The people that are drawn, they're usually the lowly guy. They're not the big honchos. The servants knew, but not the head caterer. Did everyone at the wedding know? Seems like it was limited to the servants. The merely lowly servants were well aware of the truth of God, of how the Spirit of God was used, where it came from. And again, there's so many other things that could be read into this instance. And here's the point. What's the value of this? What Christ did is parallel to what Moses did. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, Moses told the Israelites, a prophet will come like me, similar to me, doing things that I've done, behaving the way I behaved, and you should listen to him. And at Christ's very first public miracle, he introduces himself, not at large to everyone, to the servants, to his disciples, to the few that would understand. And he did it in the way that Moses did his first public miracle. He turned water into blood. Moses' first public miracle was turning water into blood. And that's the significance of that. And in fact, verse 11, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him, a result of what happened. But the word signs in the Greek, there's 3 different words that can be used for signs. This particular word, signs, refers to a miracle with a special significance. There was something special, significant about what Christ did, and this Greek word reflects that. And it is parallel to what Moses first did. There's so much meaning in what Christ had happened, when it happened, why it happened, at a wedding feast, no least. The wedding feast, where eventually all of mankind will be joined with Christ as his bride. There's so many parallels and things that could be drawn here. And it shows the beauty of what God is doing with us and the pursuit of how God is chasing us with his Spirit, and why God may very well be obsessed with water. Ending in Isaiah 55, as we too take on God's obsession and affinity for water and what it means. Isaiah 55, verse 1, come all you who are thirsty, come to the waters. And you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. That's what happens when we use this water, when we use God's Spirit. And that's what God is encouraging us to do. And this is what we can glean from the many, many, many examples that God shares with us.